Hey everyone, this is Dr. Jacobs. This week we're going to be covering infancy and toddlerhood. So there's quite a few unit learning objectives that are going to be associated with this unit. In the past, I've actually taught this unit as 2 or 3 weeks worth of information and broken them up in a little bit of a different way. So what I've tried to do is consolidate all of those unit learning objectives. And so that although there's a lot, I actually took off a whole page of them for you. So don't forget to use these as guidelines while you're moving through this week's materials. So by the end of this unit, I want you to be able to explain what distinguishes infancy and toddlerhood from the other developmental phases. I want you to be able to explain basic human brain development. So this will probably be a review for most of you who've gone through Gen Psych. So I want you to be able to explain things like synaptogenesis, myelination, neural pruning, and how this type of development interacts with other developmental theories and observations from these 2 developmental phases. I want you to be able to explain the process of neural transmission. And I want you to be able to describe the characteristics of sensory motor stage. In addition, I want you to be able to list and describe the substages of the sensory motor stage. I want you to explain language development during infancy and toddlerhood utilizing the appropriate developmental terminology. So for example, babbling, hollow phrase, telegraphic speech. I want you to be able to identify types and stages of attachment. But I also want you to be able to tell me the difference between the 2. So I want you to be able to explain what's the difference between types of attachment and phases of attachment. I also want you to be able to identify and explain Erikson's psychosocial stages related to infancy and toddlerhood. And recount the history of attachment theory. I want you to be able to synthesize the different aspects of attachment theory to explain how it impacts development. I want you to be able to describe how psychosocial theory interacts with other developmental theories. I want you to be able to explain how temperament and goodness of fit, or I just want you to be able to explain those 2 things. All right, so let's get started. So in this unit, we're actually going to cover the first 2 developmental phases after birth. So this is going to be infancy, which is age 0 up to 1 years old, and then toddlerhood, which is 1 years old up to 3. So our module materials that I don't have control over incorrectly define infancy. So these are the right ones. So these are the ones that I'll want you to use for me whenever I'm doing any tests or when we're working on our project later on in the semester. So if you remember in our last unit, we just left off where the baby was born. And so now we're going to talk about the hospital stay. So after birth, if the mother chooses to have her child in a hospital, the mother and the baby usually stay in the hospital for about 24 to 72 hours. Many times hospitals will keep the baby in the nursery while the mother sleeps, but some hospitals are kind of pushing to keep the baby in with the mother at all times now. And medical staff will come in around the clock to draw some blood, have the mother feed the baby, check the stomach and the other abdominal areas, and then also some other areas on the mother as well. The baby will go through a whole bunch of different types of screenings. They'll be screened for PKU. They'll have a hearing screening. They'll go through vaccinations. 1 or more may stay longer if it's the first baby. So hospitals tend to keep mothers longer than if she's had multiple children. If the mother had a C-section, they'll keep the mother a little bit longer just to make sure it's healing properly. If there's complications with the infant, they may release the mother and keep the infant in the NICU. So when it's time to go home, hospitals in America won't release the parent with the child unless they demonstrate or until they demonstrate they have an acceptable car seat. Some hospitals will actually go and make sure that you have the car seat installed properly. If they don't, you can always, there's many fire departments that will do this, and you can schedule a time to go in the fire department and they'll make sure that it's properly installed, because that's really important because it can actually harm the kid if it's not installed correctly. So when infants are little, they must ride in a rear-facing car seat. And then the mother will need to have someone drive her and the baby home. Mother really should not be able to drive until she can push the brake pedal all the way down without pain. So let's talk about neural development, because this is something that occurs rapidly during this phase of life, actually the first 4 years of life, if we're going to be technical. So if you remember from general psych, This is kind of what the neuron looks like. We have the cell body of the neuron. And from that, we see that we have the dendrites that are branching out. The dendrites, their function is to receive messages from other neurons in the form of neurotransmitters. And so the dendrites receive the messages. It goes to the dendrites send the message to the cell body, who then pushes it through the axon, which is that long kind of pole looking thing. And then the message will go through the terminal branches of the axon, where it'll send neurotransmitters to communicate to the next neuron. So these are just our little communication devices within the brain. You'll notice in this picture that the axon has something called myelin sheath that covers the axon. And the purpose of this is to help speed the neural impulses as it goes through the neuron, so that you don't lose communication. And so it's just like this fatty substance that insulates it. And so if you think about like why that would be helpful, it keeps the messages from flying off that axon so that it can get where it needs to go. And so later on in life, people will develop some sorts of things like a multiple sclerosis, where the immune system attacks the myelin sheath. And so in disorders like that, people can become paralyzed or have trouble with speech and things because their brain's not able to communicate efficiently, so that their body knows what it needs to be doing. So with neural development, the cerebral cortex is the outer layer of the brain. And during the first 4 years, there's rapid brain growth. And part of this is like the myelination. So different parts of the brain myelinate after different parts of the lifespan. So like when babies are first born, and we'll talk about this later in this presentation too, their eyesight's not super great. But when they get to 1 year old, it gets a lot better, almost adult-like. And what happens is the visual cortex of the brain, that part is getting myelinated so that it's able to serve its function, so it can come online. During this time, we also see synaptogenesis. So if you see here, synaptogenesis can be broken down into 2 words. We have synapse, which is talking about kind of like neurons and neural transmission, and then the word genesis, which means beginning or creation. And so synaptogenesis is the creation of different neural networks, and this is happening rapidly during this time period. And then so plasticity is like if part of the brain is damaged, the brain can actually rewire itself, and it's fairly plastic. So different parts of the brain will compensate for some problems in certain areas in the brain. So during this time, not only do we have a lot of synapses being created, but we also have a lot of neural pruning going on. So I don't know if any of you garden, but when you garden, and if you decide to do roses, they're really hard to grow because you actually have to prune them. You have to cut different parts away. And if you don't do it, then they actually choke themselves to death. And so neural pruning is when we have these neural networks that aren't being used, or they're not efficient, and they get pruned away or cut away. And this is actually really helpful for brain development, because if that doesn't happen and all of those networks are always there, it can actually mimic something called an intellectual disability. And so it actually makes it really hard for the brain to do its function because it's trying to go through all these pathways just to get a simple task done. So pruning, neural pruning helps the brain function efficiently and fast. We also have motor movement, and all basic motor movements develop in the first 2 years, starting with reflexes, which are involuntary movements in response to stimulation. So for example, there's a sucking reflex. This is when babies will suck anything that's put near their mouth. And this is a biological reflex that allows babies to nurse. There's the rooting reflex. So babies will turn their head to anything that touches a cheek. So sometimes people will rub the cheek of the baby and they'll turn their head. And that is so that they turn their head toward a breast so that they can breastfeed. The stepping reflex, this is a really cute one. If you put their feet on a flat surface, they'll move their legs like they're walking, even though they can't quite do it yet. And then the palmar grasp, babies will grasp anything that's placed in their hand. So if you put your finger in a baby's hand, they'll a lot of times put their hand around it and grasp your finger. So motor development continued. Motor development actually follows the same developmental pathway as in utero physical development that we talked about. So do you remember what those three were? So we're doing Dora the Explorer right now. So I'll ask you a question. You can pause me and then shout out the answer so you can practice. All right, so we got cephalocaudal sequence, the proximal and distal sequence, and mastospecific. So right now, like a really good suggestion is if there's something that we've learned about before, and I throw some questions out there, I know it's online, which is a little awkward, but if I throw some questions out there, you should be trying to answer them because that will help you study the materials because there's so much information that we have to learn in this class just as it's a part of the curriculum. So what was cephalocaudal sequence? So if you remember from the last unit, cephalocaudal sequence is from the head to the tail. And so motor movements develop the same way as some of this prenatal development. So like proximal and distal, we broke that word last week down into two words, proximal and distal, so close to far. So for example, your core develops a lot better before your fingers do, or even mastospecific, where you have larger structures that develop prior to the second one. So motor movements are the same way. So if I wanted to teach someone to throw a football, I'm going to teach them the major movement of, grabbing the ball, stepping back a few steps, launching their arm back, and throwing it this way. It's kind of hard to do this in my office, but I'm going to teach them those large movements first before I teach them to flick the wrist the right way so they get that tight spiral of the football. And so motor development does the same exact thing. So there's different types of motor movements. There's gross motor movements, which are large body movements. So examples of that's like walking, running, jumping. We also have fine motor movement, which are these smaller body movements, for example, riding or cutting. So there are certain developmental milestones that babies are supposed to hit at certain times. The Centers for Disease Control actually has some handouts that describe these developmental milestones. And so it's really helpful, especially not only if you're planning on having children for yourself, but if you work in a field where you're dealing with families or caregivers, foster care system, and they want to make sure that their child's hitting these developmental milestones at the right time. These can be really helpful and they're free. And so they have ones for, if we're talking about the first 2 years with infancy and toddlerhood, they have one for 2 months that you can see the screenshot I took there, 4 months, 6 months, 9 months, 1 year, 18 months, and 2 years. And so if we look at this handout that I screenshot here, at 2 months, these are the things that your baby should be doing. They should be making sounds other than crying, right? They should react to loud noises. So if I clap my hand like that, they should react to that sound. They should follow you while you move, or look at your face, or when you're doing tummy time, which is where you just lay a baby on their stomach so that they can practice lifting up and lifting their head. They should be able to hold their head up when they're on their tummy at this point. And so all these different things, if your child's not doing them, may indicate that they need to be screened for either some sort of developmental disability, or could be hearing. And so you want to kind of pay attention to these different developmental milestones, and they have ones that go through all these different ages. So example, at 2 months, you should be able to hold your head up on your own when you're on your belly. I think it's really interesting because when infants are born, they can't do anything. They can't even hold their head up on their own, which I find really very interesting. At 4 months, they should be smiling on their own. At 6 months, they should be able to roll from their belly to their back. At 9 months, they should be starting to develop something called stranger anxiety, which we'll talk about. At 12 months, they should be able to pull themselves up to standing and walk while they're holding onto things, if not walking by themselves. 15 months, they should be able to follow directions, especially if there's a gesture. So 18 months, they should be able to walk without holding on to anything. If they get to 18 months and they cannot walk on their own without holding on to anything, they need to be screened for something because that is outside of the normal range. So kids on average will start walking about 12 months, but it's not considered atypical development until we get to 1.5 years. And so different states have different programs. Missouri has a program called Early Steps where kids can be evaluated for different disabilities, whether it's motor movement, whether it's other developmental milestones, because if we can get services to kids earlier, sometimes we can remediate some things that will influence their learning once they get into school. And it's a lot better on the school system because it decreases the amount of money that they're spending on interventions, but it also helps have better outcomes for children too. At 24 months, they should be able to eat with the spoon. So the book talks about sensation and perception just a little bit. You can actually take an entire semester class on this. We offer it here at UCM. But sensation is the interaction of information with the sensory receptors, while perception is the process of interpreting what is sensed. And it's really interesting if you start studying like our perception of time or our perception of sound or sight, that the way that we understand things or the way that we interpret things, our brains do, aren't actually reflective of what's happening in reality. And you can get into a whole class on this. They actually have a whole bunch of shows on this on Netflix. If you're interested, I can try to look and see what the names of them are, but it's really interesting to see the more that I learn about sensation and perception that, for example, like we hear lower sounds, like frequency wise, as softer than high pitched sounds. Even if we have a high pitched sound and a low pitched sound at the same time, we perceive the higher pitch as louder, even though it's not. And we do this with, like I said, with even smell. I've seen someone do a lecture on how perception is with smell. It's really interesting area. So again, eyesight is very poor at birth, but is very close to adult vision at 1 year of age, which is really interesting because if you think about that within context of motor development, what else happens? What else did I tell you that happens around age 1? You're right. That's when a lot of kids are starting to be super mobile, walking around. And it's really important that they're able to see while they're doing that, or it can cause a lot more problems and injury. Hearing and taste, however, are developed in utero, which I think is really amazing. So babies can actually taste the amniotic fluid within when they're within the womb. And so some sources that I've read said, well, that's really good that pregnant humans are eating a variety of vegetables and foods to expose the baby to it before they're even born. And then hearing, they have some studies where they had people read Dr. Seuss stories to babies while they're in utero. And when they did that, they have ways that they can tell that the babies, when they're born, recognized the Dr. Seuss stories outside of the womb. We also will learn later about how infants after birth prefer the voice of their mothers, which I thought was really interesting because they're around the mother when they're in their womb enough where they can recognize it even at birth. So after a baby's born, one of the first things that they'll do is try to have the baby nurse on the mother, but breast milk actually doesn't come in right away. So if there's not breast milk, what is there, right? So there's actually something called colostrum, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But when they put the infant up to nurse, it actually causes the uterus of the mother to contract. And that is because when you nurse, it also releases the attachment hormone called oxytocin. And that is actually the same hormone that they made a synthetic version of called Pitocin, that can put people, it's how they induce labor, but it also is our attachment hormone. And also if someone hemorrhages during delivery, they actually can use that to try to stop the bleeding as well. And so it's really interesting because nursing can do this, but also skin to skin contact can also cause the uterus to contract, because then it's releasing those feel good oxytocin hormones. So this colostrum is a yellow, sticky, nutrient-dense substance, has a lot of antibodies in it. And, they say that as long as a baby is exclusively breastfeeding, so there's no formula and there's no food, which you wouldn't be given to a child right at this point anyway, that they will be immune to everything that the mother is immune to, which is really interesting. So also an infant will weigh less than birth weight when they are discharged from the hospital, and that's because they haven't quite had the milk yet. They'll hope that the baby will be back up to birth weight by the time they get to their newborn checkup. That's like 2 or 3 days after birth. So breast milk comes in about 3 to 5 days after birth. And sometimes people feel really engorged because there's too much that comes in. They'll actually have the baby alternate which breast that they're nursing from. So that helps because it can actually be super painful to breastfeed. And so they say to the American Academy of Pediatrics says to exclusively breastfeed or formula feed the infant until 6 months. So there's no food, no cow's milk. Cow's milk, babies cannot actually break down that protein in the cow's milk, and they should not be given that till after they're 1 year old. So breastfed babies eat about every 8 to 12 times. So they eat about 8 to 12 times a day. So how frequently is that each day in a 24-hour period? How often are they eating? If you said every 2 to 3 hours, you're right. And actually, you're supposed to feed babies around the clock. So you're supposed to be waking up babies even at night to nurse them every 2 to 3 hours. Formula babies, however, only eat every 6 to 8 times a day. So this is every 3 to 4 hours, which is nice. So there's benefits to both, right? So breastfeeding, they say, is the gold star. It helps with immunity. It helps with all these different parts. There's a high fat content, which can help with myelination of the brain. But formula fed babies, it's helpful because you don't have to feed them as often. And if you are working and can't nurse or things like that. So there's definitely benefits and drawbacks to both. But again, you have to wake the baby to feed them. And so the way that we tell if the baby's getting enough food is that they'll have about 6 to 8 wet diapers per day. Hospitals actually will track how many wet diapers they have. They'll also track how frequently you're breastfeeding, if that's what you're doing. And they'll do this just to make sure the baby's getting enough. Something that's really neat about breastfeeding babies is that when someone does that, the milk formulation, the mother's body actually creates the milk to meet all of the needs of the infant. So the fat content, the nutrients, all of that, the body just does it naturally. So there's some breastfeeding support because it can be really difficult. Most hospitals will have something called a lactation consultant. These are usually nurses that are trained in helping babies learn to breastfeed because it's actually really not a natural. I mean, it is natural, but it's not easy to do at first. In fact, the baby has to, so if this is the mother's breast, the baby needs to latch over the nipple and onto the bigger part of it so that they're not just on the bottom. And then the baby also has to learn how to suck as well. And they might struggle with that, or they might try to pinch with their gums. And so it can be really stressful for people to learn how to do this. So it's really helpful to have lactation consultants because they can help if whether it's like stroking the baby's cheek while they're on to help get some of those reflexes going, or trying different holds, which we'll go over some of those. There's also the La Leche League International. That's an organization that's for breastfeeding support as well. So here are some of these breastfeeding holds. I think some of them are kind of funny, but there's different reasons why you might want to change how you're nursing a child. So there's cradle hold. That's a pretty common one. There is the cross cradle hold. There's football hold, which I think is funny. Sometimes it's helpful to change the different holds that you're breastfeeding a child because nipples can get really, really sore from it. Baby might not like a certain position, so they don't latch on as well. There's also the sideline position. And the one I think is the funniest one is the Australian hold. But there's different ones to help with the different grips and so that the mother doesn't get so sore. So introducing foods, we don't start doing that till about 6 months. Usually the first food that people introduce to children is rice cereal. And then they recommend only trying one new food a week when you're starting out because that helps you test for allergies. So if this week's carrot week, you if you've already introduced rice cereal, so you have rice cereal, and then the second week you can introduce carrots where you have rice cereal and carrots, and then the week after you might have apples, pureed apples, and so you could have rice cereal, carrots, and apples. And then if they have a reaction, because you only introduced one thing in that week. Again, we have to refrain from giving infants cow's milk before they're 1 year old, because it's not good. The body can't break down the protein that's in the cow's milk. So there's some feeding challenges. Undernutrition is a huge problem in a lot of countries. And this is really problematic because if we remember about brain growth, there's a lot of brain growth going on in the first 4 years of life. And so if a child's not getting enough nutrition, not enough calories, not enough fat, you'll actually see their height stunt. So they'll stop growing tall because what the body wants to do is protect the brain, because the brain's the most important part of our bodies. And so that's called head sparing. So when the body is stunted to protect the head, we call that head sparing. And so when newborns are born, they actually sleep quite a bit. That's what they spend most of their time doing, although it's not straight sleep necessarily. So from 0 to 3 months, it's recommended that infants get 14 to 17 hours. This is not straight. Most babies don't sleep through the night. And they've done a lot of looking into this, and parents will be like, oh, my baby's already sleeping through the night. The baby's waking up and then putting themselves back to sleep. And they shouldn't be sleeping through the night because they need to be eating still. Infants 4 to 11 months, usually about 12 to 15 hours sleep. Toddlers, 11 to 14 hours of sleep. And that's where we'll leave off with, like, in terms if we're talking about the first 2 years. But if we continue, preschoolers are supposed to get 10 to 13 hours of sleep a night. School-age children are supposed to get 9 to 11 hours of sleep. Teenagers are supposed to get 8 to 10 hours of sleep. And there's a lot of research out there saying that 9 hours is probably more what they need to be getting. And then young adults need between about 7 and 9 hours. Doesn't mean that's what they're getting, but that's about how much sleep. So how much sleep are you getting? Are you getting what you need for what your body is? Because what they say is if you have to use an alarm clock to wake up, and I know I'm not saying you shouldn't, I'm not saying that you can't use it, but they're saying that if you have to use it to wake up and you don't just wake up every morning on your own, that you're actually not getting enough sleep. And so when we don't get enough sleep, that influences how we focus. It influences how we move through our daily lives. So that's just something to think about, that if you're having to rely on that alarm and you're hitting that snooze 25 times a day, it might be worth trying to readjust how your schedule is so that you can try to get some more sleep so that you can function more fully. And we see a lot of impact like that. So some people, when they're chronically tired, exhibit symptoms of ADHD. Some other people experience depressed mood, which they mistake for depression, but really they're just not getting enough sleep, which is a separate type of problem, whether it's they're forcing themselves not to get sleep or a sleep disorder even. Sleep's super important for how we function. There's also sudden infant death syndrome, SIDS. And SIDS is just this, it's an infant dies and we're not quite sure why they do. They have some theories on why kids die from SIDS without warning. And we'll talk about that in a minute. But to prevent it, they say refrain from placing anything into a crib. So you're not supposed to put stuffed animals, blankets. You're not supposed to put no bumper pads, nothing in there that's fluffy. There should just be a firm sleep surface and then a fitted sheet that's fit tightly to it. And then so people a lot of times when I say that will be like, well, Dr. Jacobs, then like, what if they get cold? And so what they have now are these, like, they're called little baby bags, and they're super cute. They look like they're like arms with it's like a big sack almost, and you zip it up and they look like a cute little sack of potatoes, and they'll kick their little legs when they're in it. And that is to keep them warm, but also to keep them from not suffocating. Also, we see reduction in SIDS deaths with that as well. Refrain from using bumper pads. So this is not as prevalent anymore because most places have stopped selling them. But what they used to do is have these bumper pads that would go around the inside of a crib, and they're super cute and have all these cute little animals or designs and things on them. And it's to prevent the baby from hitting their head on the edge of the crib. But we found that actually the use of those is not good and can increase the risk of dying from SIDS. We also They also recommend laying babies on their backs when putting them to sleep. When they did that, when they figured out that, hey, we actually need to be putting babies on their backs when they sleep, they saw a huge reduction in people dying from SIDS, which was unfortunate because prior to that, they had been telling people to lay babies on their stomachs. And that increased the number of babies that were dying. So they always say lay them on their backs. If you walk into a room and they're laying on their stomach, you just flip them back around onto their back. Again, use that firm sleep surface. Share your room with the baby, but not your bed. So in some cultures, co-sleeping is a really big thing where the baby sleeps in bed. They're saying that's actually not good for several reasons. One, increases the likelihood of dying of SIDS. Sometimes adults roll over onto their baby, and the baby unfortunately suffocates. So they're saying, yeah, it's great. Keep the baby in your room. Use something like a bassinet, though. Don't put them in bed with you. And then they also say, make sure your baby has tummy time every day. So we started talking about that a little bit. That's where you lay the baby on their stomach and you're in the room with them. And eventually they'll try to start lifting up their heads, and they'll start pushing up eventually to get some of that core strength and that other motor strength. And they also say avoid covering the baby's head, using a pacifier, keeping them up to date on their immunizations, and breastfeeding as well. So all these different things. So they have some theories, like I told you, about SIDS. And so one theory of why kids die from SIDS is that the mechanism for blood recognizing that there is carbon dioxide in it is not fully developed quite yet. So if your body doesn't understand that you have a lot of carbon dioxide in your blood, your body's not going to automatically try to roll over and things like that. This is just one theory. So if we look at some of these recommendations for how to prevent SIDS, we see things like breastfeeding or using a pacifier, which strengthens the airway, or tummy time where the baby could lift their head up if they needed to, using firm sleep surfaces so that they're not being smothered, and these things. So it may be really tied to it, but they have not said 100% this is what causes SIDS yet. There'll also be a whole bunch of well child care visits. These are medical checkups that provide preventative and screening care to children. They start a couple days after birth, and they're going to continue frequently until about age 3, when they go to yearly visits. And so if you see here, this is called the periodicity table or schedule, or periodicity schedule. And if you look here, it has all the different visits that kids are supposed to have up to 2 years old. So we have the prenatal care, newborn, which is in the hospital. We have 3 to 5 days after birth, by 1 month, 2 months, 4 months, 6 months, 9 months, 12 months, 15 months, 18 months, and 24 months. And you can see all the different types of screenings that they do, where they're screening for like maternal depression. They'll do some vision and hearing. They'll give some immunizations and different things like that. They'll also like take the weight and the height and look at the head circumference, because they want to make sure that the head's developing along the growth curves. And so with the well care checkups and vaccinations, there's a little bit of controversy. And so a long time ago, I believe that Jenny McCarthy believed incorrectly that immunizations caused autism spectrum disorders, or ASDs. This has now been disproven through genetic studies. There was a really huge study that was done across 5 major countries that found that ASDs are about 80% heritable or genetic. And so someone actually created a website. Last time I checked it, it was down. So I don't know if they put it back up, but it was called Jenny McCarthy Body Count.com, which counted all the people who died from preventable diseases because they chose not to get vaccinated, which is really interesting because this is super controversial. Yeah, no, it's back up. So the website's back up. I typed in real quick. So they say from June 3rd, 2007 to July 18th, 2015, there's 152,763 preventable illnesses that occurred, 9,028 preventable deaths. And then there was zero number of autism diagnoses that were scientifically linked to vaccines, because this is what the huge controversy was, because before that, immunizations were pretty widely accepted. But then once they got this champion and they believed that immunizations caused these, a lot of people stopped vaccinating their children. And then we started seeing a return of a lot of viruses that we thought we had fought off. So we saw huge things with like whooping cough and measles coming back. And these are really nasty things, because if we have a certain percentage of our population, and y'all are probably a lot more aware of this than some of my former classes before things like COVID happen. But if you have a certain percentage of humans that are immune to a virus, then that protects people who are not immune, whether it's that you get that immunity from a vaccine or from being infected with the virus. And so our materials gave a specific number, but the thing is that herd immunity is not established like if you get this exact percentage of the population immune. It depends on things like the incubation period, like how long are you sick before you have symptoms, or how long are you contagious, like, and does it kill people off really fast, right? Because if it kills people off before they can become immune to it, it's not going to matter, because people are going to be dead and they're not going to have that herd immunity. That's just going to keep killing people. And so when they looked at studies of siblings, they found that when someone vaccinated their first child and they had an ASD, and they refrained from vaccinating their second child, that it did not prevent people from having autism spectrum disorder. So, and that's because now we know that it's largely a genetic disorder, which is really interesting, because when I started teaching here, they didn't know what it was. And I would tell my classes, I was like, they're like, well, Dr. Jacobs, what do you think causes autism? And I said, if I were a betting human, I would say that it's probably genetic. And that's what they ended up finding. I can try to find the landmark study and put it into our module materials for this week if you're interested. It's not going to be required reading or anything like that. I try to mark the things that are required in class so that you know what you're supposed to be doing, because there are some videos and readings and things that you need to do so that you're prepared for exams and our project. But that would just be for fun extra reading if you wanted it. So if we look at our immunization schedule, I mean, there are quite a bit of immunizations that go on, and they probably will actually add onto this. Eventually, they'll probably add COVID as a yearly thing. There's a lot of advances that are going on with vaccines. And so they're trying to find some sort of global coronavirus type vaccine that would not just prevent what we're calling the coronavirus. Coronaviruses are not new, but all coronaviruses. So it'll be really interesting to see how that technology develops. So cognition, this is thinking, not intelligence, like the book or Lumen Waymaker materials indicate. This is thinking. Intelligence is something that's very different, and we'll talk about that later on in the semester. And so Piaget would say, because Piaget is our theorist for the theory of cognitive development, that we attempt to maintain cognitive equilibrium. We don't like to be out of whack. We like to not feel dissonance. We like to be in harmony. And so we do this by organizing information into schemas. If you remember from when we started introducing our developmental theory, schemas are our thinking scripts. So we did the activity where I said, okay, close your eyes, and I'm going to say a word. You tell me what you think of first. And I said, cat. And you had an image of a cat. That is your pinnacle. That's what you think a cat is. And so we have thinking scripts or schemas for anything and everything that we can possibly think about. And so assimilation is when we incorporate knowledge into our existing schema. So if I see, I'm trying to think of something. So if I see, okay, that is a white rabbit, right? And I'm like, okay, rabbits are white. But then I see this cute little polka dotted rabbit. I'm like, wait, that's a rabbit too. Okay, we can put this into my existing schema for what a rabbit is. But then accommodation occurs when we have to restructure the schema fully. So then let's say a skunk comes and I'm like, oh, cat. Not a cat, right? Not a cat. But if I'm like, oh, look, it's a cat. And then they're like, no, that is a skunk. Not all fuzzy four-legged creatures are rabbits. So then I have to fix my schema and accommodate for that new information and give skunk its own little category and realize these are the things that separate rabbits from skunks. They're different things. So a lot of things with how we think about the world come from our ability to process information, specifically our working memory. So working memory is the memory where while we're working with it, the things that we can remember. And typically when we're really little, we don't have a very large working memory. We may only have 2 or 3 slots of information that we can hold in our conscious at one time while we're manipulating it. And then as our brain becomes more developed, as we get older, we're able to hold more information. And so the average adult can hold 7 plus or minus 2 units of information. So that's 5 to 9 units of information. And so if you can hold more information and manipulate it at one time, that allows you to step back. But when we're little, we don't have that. And so while we're young and even while we're growing, the way that we're able to process information really influences how we can think, or if we can step back and think about things or not. So our first stage of sensory motor, or our first stage of cognitive development, is sensory motor stage. I like to break this word down into 2 words. We can see we have senses, like sensory, so senses, and motor. So during this stage, we learn about the world through our senses and through our motor movements. And this can actually be broken down into 6 different substages. We have reflexes, primary circular reactions, secondary circular reactions, coordination of secondary circular reactions, tertiary circular reactions, and mental representation. So the first stage of sensory motor stage is reflexes. This goes from about birth to 6 weeks. Our module of materials had 2 conflicting pieces of information. They said birth to 6 weeks, but then on the next page, they said birth up to 2 months. So I just want you to be aware of that. Most sources that I looked into said it was birth to 6 weeks. So that's what we'll stick to for this. I'm more typically not worried about numbers and dates as much as I'm usually typically more worried about you understanding the stage. So like for reflexes, from birth to 6 weeks, active learning begins with automatic movements or reflexes. That's what I'm more interested in you being able to understand than saying it happens between birth and 6 weeks. The second substage is primary circular reactions. This happens from about 6 weeks up to 4 months. And this is when there's repetitive action centered on the child's own body. So for example, around week 10, they get interested in their hands, like super interested, like, ooh, and they'll just stare at the hand and they'll just flip it and look at it. And they're super interested in it. That is a prime example of primary circular reactions. The third substage of sensory motor stage is secondary circular reactions. This happens between 4 and 8 months. And this is repetitive behaviors focused on things and people outside of the infant's own body. So for example, banging 2 blocks together or toys together, playing with pots and pans just because it's fun. No other rationale than just interested in playing with it. Then we have the substage 4, which is coordination of secondary circular reactions. This is from 8 to 12 months. And this is when they can engage in behaviors that others perform and then also anticipate upcoming events as well. Object permanence is part of the stage, and this typically happens around 8 months. And this is really interesting because this is when children realize that things exist even when they don't see them anymore. And although Piaget said it developed around 8 months, there's a lot of other researchers that indicate that it happens a lot earlier. And in most states, they have a program called Parents as Teachers, and they'll do developmental screenings, and it's a really great program. So if you have any kids that are little, or plan to have kids one day and you plan on staying in Missouri or a state that has this program, they'll actually send a developmentalist out to your house and to teach you different things to do with kids, and they'll screen for disabilities in case that you may need to get some extra services that are funded by the state to help remediate any developmental disabilities that can be helped. Fifth is we have the tertiary circular reactions. This happens between 12 and 18 months. We call this the little scientist phase because this is when they get into everything. They are wild and they want to explore and they want to play games and explore everything, trial and manner. They like to use their motor movements and planning abilities. And basically, if we're going to put this into a sentence, children manipulate the world to get results. And it's fun and wild. And a lot of parents get frustrated during this stage because they can't keep up. I also like to talk about like, I think I had this on the slide and I took it out, but I was just like, toilet paper. I don't even remember, but it's if you have a kid and they are in this stage and they are around toilet paper, you know where that toilet paper is going? It is going in the toilet. So kids will, or they'll go like this, like kids get obsessed with toilet paper. They like to manipulate it. They like to play with it. Something else they like to do. Oh yeah, it was toilet paper, sippy cups, and toddlers. Oh my. Because at this point they're toddlers and they can, typically, they have to, for typical development, they're walking by 18 months. So for this, they're, moving around, getting into things. For example, if they have sippy cups, and our materials talked about this a little bit, but like if you're at a restaurant, you can always tell who has children or have been around a lot of children and those who haven't. Because if, you're out and the kid knocks a sippy cup off the table, depending on who if someone else picks it up, depending on who they hand it to, you or the child, if they've been around children. So if they have not been around children a lot, who are they going to give it to? They're going to give it to the kid. And then the kid's just going to throw it back down or knock it down because they just entered a game with you. If they're around kids a lot, they'll hand it to the parent. So the parent can decide what to do with it. 6 is mental representation. This happens between 18 and 24 months. Solve problems using mental strategies. We also can see deferred imitation. This is repeating an action that the baby witnessed at an earlier time. A lot of times this can be language or physical actions. We also have something called a visual cliff. I'll have something in our materials so that you can review this. I can't really play the video in here because I don't want to violate any copyright. But visual cliff basically was looking at depth perception when starting crawling and things like that. And you'll learn more about this in the video that I have in our materials. But think about that. Why is it important that children develop depth perception when they start crawling? It's important to know, for them to know whether or not they can get down a certain height so that they don't get hurt. And it's also why we have baby gates, right? Because if babies don't have really good depth perception or they haven't developed it yet, they're just going to roll down the stairs, which is not safe. So how does this connect to Piaget's theory of cognitive development? So we also have language and memory. So infantile amnesia. Adults actually rarely recall personal events from before the age of 3. And they think that's because the development of language interferes with our ability to recall information. So when we're little, they believe we encode or we try to store the information in a different way than when we're adults and we have language, we try to retrieve it using language. And so we think that might be what it is. And the sensory motor stage actually ends at the development of language. So remember, sensory motor, we learn about the world through our senses and through our motor movements. And then once we develop language, that changes how we think about the world. So language development actually starts before birth. They indicate that's because babies can hear their mother's voice and recognize it. They can start to hear language. For example, like the study I told you all about, the Dr. Seuss books. So when we're talking about language development, phone names are the smallest unit of sound. So if I say the word cat, it says k, a, t, or k, at, k, at, has 3 phonemes, right? And so when we start teaching language in schools, which, would be later, we often teach phonemic awareness where we teach the letter sounds. So I don't know if y'all have heard of leapfrog, but where the A says ah, the A says ah, B says b. That's what they're trying to teach because that's one method of teaching reading and language development. Morphemes then are the smallest unit of meaning. So if I say cats, that has 2 morphemes, cat, which is the animal, and then s, which means plural. So when we say multiple cats. Expressive language then is to be able to express thoughts and feelings, while receptive language is being able to understand communications, such as thoughts and feelings. There's several different language development theories. B.F. Skinner would say that we're reinforced to learn language. Chomsky would argue that we have biological mechanisms to acquire language, specifically called a language acquisition device, or LAD, which is just he believed like a neurological pathway for developing language. And then social pragmatics would say that we learn language out of need to communicate, and we learn it socially. Language timeline, 2 to 4 months, babies start cooing. So, ooh. About 6 to 9 months, babies start babbling. And we'll kind of go through these in more detail. 12 months, babies start using holophrases. 18 months to 2 years to start using telegraphic speech. So babbling occurs between 6 to 9 months. This is repeating syllables. So it might be like ba 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 da 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 ma ma ma. Then holophrases starts around 12 months. That's where one word represents an entire thought. So for example, if you said milk, that means the baby wants some milk. Usually, that's what they want. We also have underextension and overextension. So underextension is when a kid believes that a word can be used only for a specific example. For example, that can't be a grandpa because it's not my grandpa. And then there's the opposite. There's overextension where you overapply a word beyond its meaning. So for example, every 6-year-old male is a grandpa. And then we also have a naming explosion. So around 18 months, we see a rapid increase, especially nouns in America, in the number of words that people know. So 1-year-olds usually have about 50 words that they know, whereas 2-year-olds usually have about 200 words. So it just rapidly increases. Telegraphic speech then is when they communicate in only essential words. And this is because they haven't developed grammatical correctness yet. And so it might be just 2 words or 3 words to express an entire thought. And they almost sound like an old telegraph where they couldn't put every single word in it. So for example, from our book was doggy pretty. That means that dog is pretty. Child-directed speech, AKA baby talk. This is when there's like a sing-song intonation and then exaggerating vowel and consonant sounds. Typically people, when they're talking in child-directed speech, will increase the frequency of how they deliver their words or make it a lot higher pitched. And they believe that happens because they think that kids will pay attention to it. And so they think it's just a natural thing that we've evolved to do, is use a higher pitch to keep the attention so that kids can develop language. There's also moral reasoning. The theorist for this is Lawrence Kohlberg. This is also a stage theory. So we'll see it across the semester. And so with the levels and stages of moral reasoning, Lawrence Kohlberg presented ethical dilemmas and asked why people would choose what action they chose with regards to these ethical dilemmas. At some point in the semester, after we learn more of the stages and levels, we'll actually do some of these in our online class because it's kind of fun. Kids typically make choices based on whether they're going to be reinforced or punished till they're about age 9. And so if we're making our decisions on that, we consider that the pre-conventional level of moral reasoning. There's 2 stages that go along with that. We're not going to go into that into detail right now. We will do that in a later module. In infants, they do studies with the puppets to figure out different types of things with this, and there's plenty of that within your reading for this week. So we also move on to attachment theory, which is huge. And so they actually say that attachment is connected to development of cognition and memory. And so, for example, like stranger wariness, being wary of new people, indicates that the brain's developing and the cognitive abilities are increasing. Even like separation anxiety that starts around 7 months and peaks at 14 months, that the child's able to remember who they're around frequently, who's their caretaker, who do they want to be around to get their needs met. And so when we're talking about these different things, we're back to John B. Watson, who is famous for putting his foot in his mouth in some ways. And so let's read his quote of what he thought about attachment. When I hear a mother say, "Bless its little heart," when it falls down, I have to walk a block or two to let off steam. Can't she train herself to substitute a kindly word for the pickup, the coddling? Can't she learn to keep away from the child a large part of the day? And then he made this memorable statement: I sometimes wish that we could live in a community of homes where we could have the babies fed and bathed each week by a different nurse. And so here we know today that you probably should not take parenting advice from John B. Watson because it had really poor outcomes. But there was a lot of households that really latched on to what John B. Watson said about this for themselves. And we also have Conrad Lawrence. I was really sad that our materials left him out quite a bit. He was the one who had baby goslings, and when the baby goslings hatched, they saw him, and he effectively became their mother. So if you've ever read the Twilight series where they talk about imprinting, the baby geese imprinted on a Conrad Lawrence and basically became he became their mother, and he would follow them around. He would swim and they would follow him like he was Mama Duck. He had like a whistle when they could fly, and they would come back to him. If he was like canoeing, they would follow him in his canoe, because he was the precursor to attachment theory, and so is Harry Harlow. And so Harry Harlow was famous for which study? And the picture gives it away a little bit. If you said the monkey studies, you're right. Well, before Harlow, what did psychologists think about why babies attach to mothers? If you said they thought that babies attach to mothers because mothers nursed the babies, you're right, that's what they thought. And so in this landmark study, they found that wasn't necessarily the case, and that babies actually preferred comfort to the cloth monkeys as opposed to the wire monkeys. And a lot of video of the actual footage from it, because it shows the study. When you watch it, you may be a little disheartened. I know some people really don't like what they did to the monkeys. They kind of spook them a little bit, but you'll be able to see what they did with the studies from actual footage from the experiment. We also have John Bowlby, famous for creating the stages of attachment. And so right now we're concerned with the stages of attachment within the first couple of years. So first we have pre-attachment phase, which is the first 3 months, where kids don't really give a preference to a caregiver. And then we have attachment in the making 4 to 7 months, where they start to have some preliminary preferences, and then clear cut attachment, where they have an attachment style, which is separate. Because attachment style or attachment types came from Mary Ainsworth, I kind of spoiled that question for y'all, but she was famous for the strange situation, which helped get us attachment types. So what was the strange situation? This is where they put an infant in a room with their primary caregiver, have the caregiver leave, and eventually have the caregiver return. And so during this, what they look at is they look at what are the reactions of the children when the caregiver leaves, and what do they do when they're gone, and what do they do when they return. And that can put them into their different attachment styles. So according to Bowlby, attachment is the lasting psychological connectedness between human beings. According to Benet, 2004, attachment is involved with making the child feel safe, secure, and protected. The thing that's interesting is that we don't just talk about attachment within childhood, we'll also talk about it within adulthood as well. We have a primary attachment figure when we're younger. So this is a person that the child believes is the one who takes care of them, that they have. Again, stages of attachment is the stages of how attachment develops, while types of attachment are the different brands or styles of attachment that someone has with another human. So our stages of attachment, pre-attachment starts at birth. There's no preference for a caregiver quite yet. And then when we get to attachment and maintenance stage, that starts around 4 months again. And that's where we have slight preference for a caregiver, but still okay with strangers. And then we have clear-cut attachment, which starts around 7 months. And this is when they become upset to when a primary attachment figure leaves. So attachment can be broken down into secure versus insecure attachment. Secure attachment has better outcomes for children. There's only one type of secure attachment and 3 types of insecure attachment. And insecure attachment puts children at risk for socio-emotional issues further along in development. There's also organized versus disorganized attachment. So organized attachment, the child knows what to expect from the primary caregiver, while disorganized attachment, the child doesn't know what to expect from their primary caregiver. And so these different things will help us decide what type of attachment style a child has. So if we look at this, a secure attachment, the child knows what to expect from their caregiver, and they believe their needs are going to be met. Avoidant attachment, they are organized, but they're insecure. Anxious ambivalent attachment, they're organized but insecure. Disorganized attachment, they're disorganized and insecure. All right, so if we look at secure attachment, this is developed when caregivers are consistent and respond lovingly to children when they're distressed. These kids get upset when they're separated from the caregiver and comforted when they're reunited. Avoidant attachment, infants whose caregivers consistently respond to distress in insensitive or rejecting ways, such as ignoring, ridiculing, or becoming annoyed, often develop avoidant attachment. When they are separated and reunited with their caregiver, they are typically indifferent upon reunion. Anxious ambivalent, this is infants whose caregivers respond in inconsistent, unpredictable, and or involving ways, such as expecting the infant to worry about the caregiver's own needs, or by amplifying the infant's distress and being overwhelmed. These kiddos might develop anxious ambivalent attachment. Sometimes you'll see this referred to as insecure resistant attachment style, and our materials actually called it resistant attachment style. So when they are separated and reunited, they often show significant distress. So not just when the parent leaves, but when they come back. A disorganized attachment is insecure and disorganized. 82% of kids in higher situations show this type of attachment. This is when they freeze or are scared when reunited with their caregiver. Often this can also happen because the caregiver exhibits atypical parenting behaviors when interacting with the kid. Many times parents who exhibit these types of parenting behaviors have unresolved prolonged mourning or trauma. And we also have temperament. This may influence attachment style as well. And temperament is just inborn differences in emotions, activity, and self-regulations. And there's different parts of this that we can learn about. So there's different dimensions, such as activity level, regularity, approach withdrawal, adaptability, responsiveness, reaction intensity, mood quality, distractibility, persistence / attention span. And so these different combinations can kind of give a style of temperament. And so we have these different temperament profiles. So for example, 40% of people are classified into easier flexible temperaments. 15% are classified into slow to warm up or cautious temperaments. About 10% are considered difficult or feisty. And then about 35% of people can't be fit into one of those 3 different areas. So they might be exhibit some things in certain situations, and they just don't easily fit into these profiles. We also have goodness of fit. This is how a child's temperament matches their environment. So for example, it might be your caregiver. So if you have a kid that has a lot of energy, is constantly moving, while you have a parent that's very reserved and doesn't like a lot of noise and stimulation, things like that, that might not be a great fit, and that can cause problems for a child. And the same's with the school. So if we go back and look at these dimensions real quick, if we have a kid that has or a teacher even that has poor mood quality, and the kid doesn't have poor mood quality, that could cause conflict within the classroom as well. Emotional regulation. So kids when they're little will actually reference an adult to see how they react to guide their own reaction. So if a kid thinks that the parent's terrified, they're going to be terrified too. Or if a parent's smiling, they'll probably smile back. Like if something happens and someone like jumps out, they might look at the parent real quick to see if the parent's scared. And if the parent's scared, they for some reason believe that they should be scared as well. So that's how they regulate kind of their own emotion. We also have psychosocial stages. What's the first psychosocial stage that you learned about? And what is it? You said it was trust versus mistrust, you're right. So trust versus mistrust, this stage, basically people learn to trust or mistrust the world based on whether or not their caregiver is able to give their needs or meet their needs. So if a child is constantly being neglected and their parents not taking care of the things they need to, they might learn to mistrust the world. Whereas if you have a very attentive parent that's making sure that the baby's being fed and diapers changed and clean clothes and playtime and hugs, and they're gonna learn that maybe the world's not too bad. So how does trust versus mistrust relate to attachment? I just want you to think about it, and just you can either discuss this in our module materials or just think about it. But that's something really good that you should think about. What is the second psychosocial stage? And then what does it mean? So Erickson's second psychosocial stage is autonomy versus shame and doubt. And so during this stage, basically, children are starting to explore, right? So autonomy versus shame and doubt, they can walk now and they're going to explore. And autonomy means being able to do things on your own. So if a parent allows their child to have autonomy and explore and do things, not things that are going to get them hurt or anything, but if they're allowing them to do things, they're going to develop a sense that I can do things on my own. Versus if they have a parent that doesn't let them do anything all the time, they might learn to feel shame and doubt themselves. So that's what we have for this week. There's a lot of information, so definitely please let me know if you have any questions about all the materials that we're learning. So I'll see you next time.